Okay. Welcome to class 18. We are covering more heuristics and cognitive biases. The in-person version of this class opened with a survey, and I have not replicated that online. So I'm just going to walk you through the lesson of the survey, and you don't get the fun of playing out the game for yourself. Um, Basically, what happens is everyone is given a piece of paper with two choices on it, option A and option B. And for everyone, the two choices are mathematically the same. Option A gives you a sure outcome. At the end of the experiment, you have $1,500. Option B involves a risk. At the end of the experiment, you have a 50% chance of having $2,000 and a 50% chance of having $1,000. So everyone has two options and they're mathematically the same. I should note that under economic models of rationality, the way economists assume people behave when they behave rationally, you should be indifferent between these two outcomes, actually. Because the way you understand the value of an outcome in economics is to multiply the dollar value of it happening times the chance of it happening. So in option B, you've got 50% chance of 2,000, that's 1,000. 50% chance of 1,000 is 500. So it adds up to 1,500. So according to the economists, you should be um, equally likely you should be indifferent between these two options. Um, but actually, that's not the way most people behave. Most people um, prefer sure outcomes to unsure outcomes and therefore choose option A. However, there are situations where people's preferences get reversed. And so I said that everyone in the class had the same two options, but the options are only the same mathematically. Um, in some cases, the options are worded one way, and in another case, they're worded another. So actually, in the first scenario, the first version of the two options, everything is phrased as a gain. So in option A is someone gives you on top of anything else you own $1,500, and option B is someone gives you on top of everything else you own either $1,000 or $2,000. The second kind of survey people got, option B is turned into a loss. So what happens is um, option I'm sorry, the options are phrased as losses. So for option A, you get $2,000 and then 500 is taken away. Um, and then for option B, you get $2,000 and either no money is taken away or $1,000 is taken away. So suddenly, um, people's attitudes change. That is, if you just are talking about how much money you get for free, people are risk averse. Um, People do not take risks for gains. However, all you have to do is give something and then say you're going to take it back. Suddenly things are phrased as a loss. People will take risks to avoid losses. So again, the two versions of this choice are mathematically identical. One is phrased in terms of gains and one is phrased in terms of losses. And what happens is when it's phrased in terms of losses, people switch from being risk averse to being risk seeking, right? Or at least open to risk. So yeah, I don't have numbers to put in here, but I will just make some up. So I think the way it worked is in the in-person class, everyone who got scenario one chose option A. And I think maybe there were 6 people there. Um, so everyone chooses option A because people are risk averse. naturally, in normal circumstances, you're risk averse. That's just a standard way to be. But in scenario 2, where things are suddenly framed as losses, people's behavior changes, and some people are now open to taking a risk, right? So it was like 4 and 2, maybe. The point is, again, situations that are mathematically identical can can yield different results depending upon how the question is worded. So here again is the summary from the Southworth and Sawyer textbook. People are risk averse when it comes to potential gains. People are risk seekers, or at least more open to risk, when it comes to losses. And it's important to note that this has real world consequences. So Southworth and Sawyer reference a study where radiologists are given descriptions of 2 kinds of treatment: radiation therapy or surgery. This is for a hypothetical lung cancer case. And in half the cases, the description was framed in terms of the cumulative probability of living longer than a given time frame, that is, gains. In the other half of the cases, it was framed in terms of dying within that span, losses. So the same effect occurs. People preferred radiation therapy 78% of the time when it was done in terms of surviving, but only 58% of the time when it was done in terms of mortality. And these are doctors. These are people who are making decisions about people's lives, or at least coaching them in decisions about their lives. So what we're looking at here is a version of the framing effect. And we saw the framing effect earlier in the section on memory. There we said that the framing effect meant that the wording of a question can affect the way something is remembered. So when we were discussing memory, we pointed out that asking someone how long was the movie will get slightly different answers than asking how short was the movie. So this is the framing effect in memory. We can now see the framing effect in decision making. The wording we use to describe our choices affects how we make those choices. Options in terms of avoiding losses are preferred over the same options when phrased as a gain. So we're actually looking at the intersection of several different effects here. One, there's a framing effect, but what the different wordings of the framing influence are 2 other cognitive biases. One is loss aversion. A loss of a given size seems bigger than a gain of the same size. So in scenario B, you are activating people's sense of loss aversion, and that overcomes their normal status, which is risk aversion. So there's a classic experiment by Kahneman and Tversky where subjects are either given a free mug or free chocolate or nothing. So I love these experiments where they just give you stuff. Come on in, undergraduates, have some chocolate, have a mug, or nothing. They're then given the opportunity to trade for something else. And even though you were given whatever you were given, it was random, people who got people generally chose to keep what they got first. So people who got chocolate decided that they liked chocolate. People who got a coffee mug decided, because they got it, that they would prefer a coffee mug. And then there was this weird thing where people who chose nothing had a slight bias towards choosing the mug. I would emphasize that a lot of the more extreme results from this research, because it got really, really trendy for a long time there, and some of the stuff hasn't replicated. So I'm assuming that things like people with a bias people who got nothing having a bias towards a mug is just noise. There's a lot of noise in this research, and we're just trying to focus in on a few things that we know are for real. Risk aversion, framing effect, and loss aversion are all very real. Sometimes loss aversion gets specifically labeled the endowment effect. And this is because we're now specifically thinking about cases where you're given something, endowment. So this is a cognitive bias that causes us to value things we have more than we would value the same thing if someone else had it, right? So we require more money to sell something than we would pay if we were buying the exact same thing. All right. So questions 1 to 4 in your exercise set have to do with loss aversion and framing effects. And so if you haven't done that already, please do it now. Related bias is what we call status quo bias. And that's just wanting to keep things the way they are now. Change bad. Honestly, a lot of these biases kind of overlap. So status quo bias is a lot like the endowment effect in that they're both saying, I want things to stay the way they are, especially the things that I have. And a lot of this is all about risk aversion, ultimately. You don't change bad, change bad. There's a lot of underlying change bad. But status quo bias has a particular offshoot that I want to focus on more closely because it can get extremely pernicious. The status quo bias can lead to something called the just world hypothesis. And this is just the belief that, on the whole, life is fair. Things turn out basically the way they should. And this is important because it's the underlying psychology behind victim blaming. So this was researched for many years by a psychologist named Melvin Lerner, who then summarized it in a book called Belief in a Just World, A Fundamental Delusion. So I want to dig down on this because victim blaming is a real and dangerous phenomenon. So people will love to say, life isn't fair. Who told you life is fair? But people's attitudes towards victims suggest that they do think life is fair. People really don't like to think that bad things can happen to good people for no reason. So when something bad happens to someone, there's a strong urge in a lot of people out there to ask, what did they do to deserve it? And so one prominent place where this kind of victim blaming comes up is sexual assault cases, where it combines with misogyny and patriarchy to make people think that the woman who was a victim of sexual assault actually did something to deserve it. She led the guy on, or she was promiscuous or something. But this isn't just limited to cases of sexual assault. Another place it comes up is with police violence. If an unarmed black man is shot by the police, the tendency to victim blame combines with racist background assumptions to again make us ask, what did he deserve? What did he do to deserve it? So really, when people say life isn't fair, first of all, I've only noticed people say, "Who told you life is fair?" when something bad is happening to someone else and they're trying to get you to stop complaining. But even then, people don't really believe it because, again, they actually think that for the most part, bad things happen to bad people. If something bad happened to you, you must have deserved it. And this gets built into the structure of all kinds of religions. There are lots of folk beliefs that say, if a baby is born with a disability, the family must be cursed. Doctrines of karma in Indian religions are sometimes used to victim blame. There are branches of Christianity where wealth is taken as a sign that you are blessed by God, and poverty is a sign is taken as a sign that you are in the thrall of the devil, or you're cursed, or you're lazy. This is especially true these days of the prosperity gospel, but it has roots in 19th century Christianity. And so this kind of victim blaming is a broad human tendency. Um, and I buy the theory that it comes from fear, right? Um, we all think we're good people, basically. And if bad things can happen to good people for no reason, then bad things can happen to us. We don't want to believe that bad things can happen to us. So we seek explanations when bad things happen to people that attempt to explain why they actually deserve it. So the just world hypothesis is a version of status quo bias that leads to victim blaming. It's a very important psychological phenomenon that you need to be careful of as a critical thinker, right? And also as a moral thinker. So this actually comes up in this has come up in my own life in an interesting way, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I want to emphasize it anyway. This is a field guide I was reading for activists looking to combat bullying against queer and gender nonconforming kids in schools, and both of my kids are queer and or gender nonconforming. And so I became active in trying the movement to try to protect them. Popular Comms is a group that gives communications advice for people who want to spread a message, in this case, an anti-bullying message. And here's something that they gave in one of their reports that really struck me. Under the heading, What to Avoid, they said, avoid introducing vulnerable and targeted students as victims first. It's not fair, but psychologists have long recognized a common tendency to blame victims rather than sympathize with them. And in the longer version of this report, they actually do specifically cite Melvin Lerner's research. So the good news is that the simple act of first establishing individuals as protagonists with goals, for instance, a student who has a dream about their future, and then introducing how something or someone is threatening or stopping them, increases empathy and invites perspective taking. So it's weird, but if you say, this legislation about trans youth is going to lead to trans kids being bullied, that is not an effective talking point because people will switch to victim blaming mode. But if you tell a story about a kid, oh, and she just wants to go to college, she wants to study music in college, she plays violin. You introduce her as a protagonist first, and then introduce the bad thing that happens. But because of bullying, she attempted suicide. Now the audience sympathizes. This is, I would say, this is both kind of callous and irrational. This is a callous and irrational part of human thinking, that we don't automatically sympathize with victims, but it's right there. And the way around it is actually to tell stories differently. So unlike a lot of critical thinking, this isn't so much combating a bad emotional tendency with a pure rational tendency, which rarely works anyway. It's actually combating a bad emotional tendency with a good emotional tendency. And all of this gets back to the fundamental lesson that I've been trying to emphasize in this course, that the secret to dealing with emotion in critical thinking is not to try to bury emotion or to be non-emotional, but to use the same metacognitive skills you bring to rationality to your emotion. So be emotionally intelligent. Emotional intelligence reinforces cognitive intelligence. All right. So more versions of this of this same change bad bias that we've got. The sunk cost fallacy. Basing a decision based on past investments that are already gone rather than current prospects. Basically, if you start spending money on a project and it goes badly, you're going to want to keep spending money on it because you've already spent some. You want to recoup those sunk costs. Gamblers get sucked into this all the time. Oh my God, I lost $10,000. I'm going to have to gamble more to get it back. This also comes up in military policy. Countries may continue to engage in a losing war because otherwise the deaths of the soldiers who have already fallen would be in vain. So the lesson here is don't think about how much you have invested in something. Think about what the likelihood of future payoffs is. Look forward in time and assess probabilities. Don't look backward in time. A couple others that are kind of random here, but we need to cover them all. There's something called the validity or repetition effect. I don't know why people call it the validity effect. Repetition is a much better name. But the fact is, the mere repetition of a claim will increase people's tendency to believe it. Just repeating something, maybe with slightly different wording, makes people believe it more. This is a key technique in disinformation and propaganda campaigns. Often irrational ideas, genuinely ideas that at first, when you first look at them, seem completely ridiculous, can become more plausible just by being repeated. So here's an old Pizarro cartoon about Karl Rove. Karl Rove was a political strategist who worked for the second Bush administration. And he's talking to Plato, the philosopher. He says, "But surely you agree that truth can be created by the repetition of a lie." And this is, again, a common propaganda tactic. Okay. Another one that I want to cover here is something that actually Southworth and Sawyer only cover briefly. I wish they focused on it more because I think of it as the mother of all cognitive biases. It's the deepest one, the hardest one to avoid. And this is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a tendency to discount or ignore evidence that and arguments that contradict your current beliefs. So one common one is that people will just choose news sources that are slanted towards their own beliefs. It's important to see that this is not something that can be thought of in terms of argument or fallacy, because it often happens before beliefs are even formed. It's not about moving from one set of premises to a conclusion, from moving from one set of beliefs to another. It's about how your information is initially filtered. It also doesn't really work well as a heuristic because it's not really a shortcut. I mean, you do have to filter information, but there's no particular reason to filter it this way, except that we need to preserve our sense of self, our stability, that sort of thing. All right. An interesting aspect of confirmation bias is the fact that the very idea of disconfirming evidence is sometimes difficult for people to work. So 3 experimenters asked subjects to watch a dot on a screen and make guesses about its behavior. Some were asked to confirm generalizations about the dot's movement, and others were asked to disconfirm them. And people had a harder time disconfirming than confirming. This is also important because of the basic methodology of science. The idea of disconfirming evidence is central to science. Sometimes people say it's all there is to science, but that's not true. But at the very least, scientific hypotheses have to be open to disconfirming evidence. When you make a scientific prediction, there has to be a way you can be wrong. And this is important because scientific thinking has been the model for critical thinking since the beginning. Since John Dewey wrote The Way We Think, John Dewey's model for good thinking was scientific thinking. And a hella important part of scientific thinking is being willing to say to yourself, okay, what would it take for me to admit I'm wrong? What counts as disconfirming evidence? And this is difficult for people to do. People find it much easier to look for confirming evidence. So Southworth and Sawyer conclude by saying it should help to convince you of the value of this should help to convince you of the value of negative evidence, and make it a practice of looking for it. Like if you decide something, ask yourself, what is it going to take for me to say, oof, that was a bad decision, I need to get off this train. Basic lesson in critical thinking. Okay, that's it for this class. For the next class, we're going to look at a particular phenomenon that underlies a lot of groupthink, bad groupthink, and that's cognitive dissonance.